Hey everybody, welcome to lesson 4 of chapter 1. This is what is an environmentally sustainable society. We're going to learn what it takes to make one and some of the people who got us started in the beginning. Here are your gray box. We're going to describe the rise of the environmental conservation and protection in the U.S. We're going to explain the difference between preservation and conservation, and we're going to discuss how people can achieve the environmentally sustainable society. And let us get started. What is an environmentally sustainable society? In order to live sustainably, one has to live off the natural resources without depleting or degrading the natural capital that supplies these natural resources. Now that sounds like a bunch of natural. All right, so let's think about it. To live sustainably, you have to live off of the resources without depleting them. We have an example a little bit later that I think will go a long way towards helping explain this. I'll show you in a minute. All right, so this chapter consists of a lot of the history, the background of the environmental and conservation and preservation movements in the U.S. So when the European colonists first got here, when what is now the U.S., they looked at North America with its abundance of land and trees and animals, and they just thought that it was endless, just waiting to be conquered and managed for humans. And so they cleared forests and built settlements and plowed grasslands, and they did all sorts of crap, mining for gold and lead and everything else, and they didn't care what they did. They didn't care because they looked at the U.S. like it was endless. And compared to Europe, I mean, Europe is so tiny and the U.S. is so big, it probably might have looked endless to him, but it's certainly not endless. The first guy who realized it was this guy, George Perkins Marsh, in 1864. He was a congressman, and he was one of the first people who questioned the idea that the resources were inexhaustible. He used scientific studies to show the rise and fall of past civilizations like Rome and Greece and Egypt. All of those past civilizations, they started to fall because they outused their resources. They used up their resources and they didn't care for them wisely. And he studied all of the old cultures, Rome, Greece, Egypt, all of those old cultures. They ran out of their resources, and that's when it fell. And so what he knew is that we have to be careful of our soils, our water supplies, and all of our other sources. He was one of the very first founders of the conservation movement. There's a really good quote right under my face right there when you get to do your own. So after the last guy, Marsh, began working on the what did we call it? The beginnings of the conservation movement, it quickly split into two factions, all right, two groups who wanted to do protecting the earth differently. All right, the first group was called preservationists, and the preservation, you hear the word preserve, okay, they wanted to protect nature and leave everybody else out of it. Okay, so John Muir, he was a geologist. This was the late 1800s, early 1900s, and he founded the Sierra Club, which is actually still a real strong political force as far as environmentalism goes. But he went into Yosemite and just fell in love, and he knew that if too many humans got in here, the whole place would be messed up. So he was completely for the idea of preservation, setting aside, okay, the wildlands and not letting the humans in at all. Okay, that's preservation. The other idea was conservation. It's on the next slide. Okay, so conservation, their idea is to go ahead and use the nature, use the resources that are there, but use them very carefully. All right, Teddy Roosevelt was one of the main guys on here. The other guy is Gifford Pinchot. But Teddy Roosevelt, you know, he was the president of the U.S. In the early 1900s, and 1901 to 1909. And being the president, he knew the U.S. needed stuff. We needed our resources. We needed the people to have jobs. We needed our stuff. And so he knew that the idea of just setting aside the wilderness and locking it away from everybody wasn't going to work. We need to be able to use those resources, but we need to use them very wisely. They believe that all public lands should be managed and used wisely and scientifically to provide resources to everybody. And Roosevelt's term in office, 1901 to 1909, is called the Golden Age of Conservation. He set up more than 50 national wildlife parks. And it also tripled the size of the national forest reserves. And again, he's using it for, he has the idea of conservation, actually using the material but using it wisely. And so when he increased the size of the national forest reserves, there's all of a sudden all that lumber that can be used as a resource as long as we use it wisely. So the preservationists from the last slide, preservation want to lock away nature, keep it safe and away from humans. The conservationist says we need to use it, but we have to use it carefully. So this guy here on this slide, he had a blended approach. Okay, he did both because they're both right. Okay, both guys are right. This guy is Aldo Leopold, and he was a manager, professor, writer. Writer is the main thing for him. He is the most quoted voice in all of the history of conservation. He's like the father of conservation. He was a very, very prolific writer, and so almost all of the early conservationists used his books as their guidebooks and how to do it. So he laid the groundwork for the whole field of environmental ethics. Okay, and his idea was that, I like this quote here, the role of the human species should be protect nature, not conquer it. The role of the human species should be to protect nature, not to conquer it. And so that's where he kind of blended the two ideas of conservation versus preservation. Okay, now we'll have several exercises where you're practicing to know the two of those, preservation versus conservation. Now, this is coming up now. We're doing this like in history, so you are doing a timeline as well. All right, just going to knock these people out, say what happened during the different times. We're up now to about the 50s, 1950s. And so we had to broaden our view of conservation, not just trees and animals, but we had to bring it up to air and water and soil. We had to expand our view of conservation and preservation. The prominent pioneer in this was Rachel Carson, and I believe we talked about her a little bit at the beginning, but I can't remember for sure if we did. She was the main kickoff of, you know how that in the 1970s you had that back to earth movement with the hippies with the flower children? Okay, I'm not talking about some of the other stuff the hippies did. I'm talking about the flower children, the going back to nature. Okay, her book Silent Spring was the main thing that they were getting their information from. And with Silent Spring, DDT, it tells you here that it was the harmful pesticides DDT. DDT kills mosquito larvae. You know, mosquito larvae are in the water. Kills them really, really well. Everybody hates mosquitoes, and you know, mosquitoes cause malaria. It sounds like a great idea. This pesticide was great for killing mosquitoes. All right, but the problem with pesticides is our liver's job is to break down toxins. All right, but if the body doesn't recognize what the toxin is, it can't break it down. It just stores it. So with the baby mosquito larvae, their bodies didn't know what the DDT was. So it did kill them, but before it did, the DDT that they ingested was stored in their livers, or whatever the liver equivalent is for a bug. All right, and then the tadpoles would go eating the mosquito larvae. And again, the DDT that mosquito larvae ingested would now be inside the tadpole, but he doesn't eat just one, he eats many. So all of the DDT that was in all of the mosquito larvae is now in that tadpole. And he doesn't recognize, the tadpole's liver doesn't recognize what that is. So it just stores it. Then comes along the small fish. The small fish is going to eat the tadpoles. And it's going to get all of that DDT that's in that tadpole from all of those other mosquito larvae. But that small fish doesn't eat just one tadpole. He eats many tadpoles, and all of those many tadpoles have eaten many mosquito larvae. So it's like an compounding effect up the food chain. Well, not many people care about frogs and turtles and little small things, but what started happening is, you know that bald eagles are primary fisher birds. They're scavengers too, but when they're hunting, they eat fish. And so the bald eagles were getting these fish that had been poisoned up the food chain with all this DDT. When the eagles started eating this fish, and their bodies started becoming overwhelmed in DDT, when they would lay their eggs, when the mother eagles would lay their eggs, the shell was incredibly soft. The shell was incredibly soft, and so no matter how carefully she sat down on her nest, she broke the eggs. So there were less and less eagles being born. And it took a while before they put together 2 and 2 from the DDT, but as soon as they did, there was an outcry. We can't be without our bald eagles. I mean, they're freaking American. So especially back there in the 50s, that was a huge thing. Nowadays, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But in the 50s, America, the bald eagle, that was the thing. And if something's happened to the bald eagle, people are going to go bonkers. So with her writing the book, it was called Silent Spring. It's like, what if one springtime we didn't hear the animals? We didn't hear frogs. We didn't hear birds. We didn't hear them because we had killed them all. And it was written so strong and so powerfully that she moved an entire generation. The entire generation of the hippies, with the whole earth consciousness thing that they had, was based on her book. So she heightened public awareness immensely about all of the dangers of the pesticides, and it started a lot of regulations, and we were more careful about the kind of chemicals we were using in the world. Okay, so right about this same time that Rachel Carson was writing Silent Spring, the U.S. was going under some major industrialization. They actually used to use on their letterheads, they would have pictures of factories blowing smoke out. I mean, blowing tons of smoke out the factory. They put it on their letterheads because it means, they considered it progress. A working factory is progress in action. And so there was a ton of industrialization in the 1940s to 1970s, rapid growth and industrialization, because that's when the U.S. really became a world player as far as all the things that we did. But because of that, we have air and water pollution, mounds of solid hazardous waste. And here's some examples of how bad it was at the time. Air pollution was so bad in many cities that the drivers had to use their headlights during the day. All right, thousands died each year from the effects of air pollution, lung cancer and stuff like that. This river in Ohio, now there's a ton of factories in Ohio, tons. All right, this river was so bad polluted that with oil and other crap, it actually caught fire several times, not just once, but multiple times. The river was on fire because of all the oil and crap and pollution that they'd put in it. There's a huge oil spill in California. Now, we are used to oil spills now, but they had no idea how bad the oil spills were. And then a lot of our well-known wildlife started to become endangered. The bald eagle, grizzly bear, whooping crane, peregrine falcon, all of these species that are big American icons started to become endangered. All right, so again, it was because of the pollution and the industrialization. So here is an overview slide. We're going to have several overview slides, and these are the ones that will be really helpful to you when you're doing your timelines. So this is the early years of a conservation. So at first, the European American settlers felt like America's resources were endless. Once we started some conservation, the very first guy was Marsh. Okay, he was the very first conservation efforts. But then we split into two groups in the early 20th century. We had the preservationists who wanted to fully protect the wilderness, and that was Muir, and then the conservationists who wanted to use the land wisely but carefully and still get the natural resources out of them, and that's Theodore Roosevelt and that Pinchot guy. And then, of course, we got a nice blending because both sides had good points, and the blending came from Leopold. All right, and then moving on into the mid-20th, so that was the early 20th century, and now mid-20th century, we have the industrialization leading to the air and water pollution in huge amounts. And then at the same time, around that same time, Silent Spring is being written by Rachel Carson that brings people's awareness and starts the movement of general people to try to make some changes. All right, so now we're up into the 70s, and remember I told you these were the flower children, right? So they called the 70s the decade of the environment. So the growing publicity over all of these problems that we were mentioned is starting to lead people to demand government action. Remember, this is the 70s, so people are picketing and having rallies and sit-ins and all kinds of stuff. 1970 is also, we had the very first Earth Day. And at the very first Earth Day, there are 20 million people in over 2,000 communities who wanted to take part in this thing. That is huge. And they had a lot of rallies and stuff to demand improvements in, at government, in the different government buildings and whatever. They were rallying out front to demand improvements in environmental quality. We also, in the 70s, we developed the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. And right there at first, the Environmental Protection Agency was crazy strong and doing amazing stuff. I'm going to tell you some more about what happened to them in a minute. But we passed a whole bunch of environmental laws. And if those laws had been allowed to hold, we would have had just about everything handled. Because in the 70s, they made these laws, they created the Environmental Protection Agency, and they were ready to fix it all. However, we got some more about the 70s. When the 80s hit, then we got a problem. Okay, but still within the 70s, it's called the Decade of the Environment, and the U.S. led the world in expanding environmental awareness and developing wildlife conservation and strengthening environmental protection. Like I said, we were doing it right. If we had been allowed to continue, it would have been amazing. And since 1970s, many grassroots environmental organizations, grassroots means just kind of led by the little people. That's kind of what it means. So many grassroots environmental organizations have sprung up to deal with the environmental threats. The interest in the environmental issues grew into many college courses, like ours, environmental science. It began around that same time. It didn't exist before then. Okay, and so the college courses are becoming more common. Individuals became aware of the critically complex, large environmental issues. It's not just one thing. Environmental issues are never just one thing. They're related to a whole bunch of others. It's a complex system of problems that we've got to deal with. Losses in biodiversity, ocean pollution and acidification, the atmospheric warming, the threat of climate change, all of those things are interrelated and kind of complex. And so people are becoming more aware of this. We started around into the 70s. All right, so we have the 70s with a section all by itself. Like I said, the 70s is considered the decade of the environmentalism. All right, so in the 70s, the American public started to demand action in response to environmental problems. We had the first Earth Day, we had the EPA, a lot of good environmental laws, and a lot of environmental groups and college courses to educate people about the kind of stuff that was going on. Okay, but then I said the 80s were going to come along. In the 80s, we had, everything was all about big business and yuppies. And during the 80s, there was a backlash against all of the environmental laws, because the environmental laws, sorry, there's something on there. The environmental laws favored the environment. They did not favor big business. They didn't care about big business. They wanted the environment treated well. Well, big business is pretty powerful. Big business can twist the laws. Big business has half the government in their back pocket. So if you're going to put big business in a bind, they're going to fight back. And that's exactly what happened. So the corporate leaders and some of the members of Congress started poking holes in all of the EPA laws. They basically took the teeth out of everything. The EPA now doesn't really mean anything anymore. It used to be amazing, but now the EPA is so owned by government, it's so in the back pocket of government, that most of the EPA stuff is not as valid as it ever was, and as it was when it was first invented. So here in this middle bullet, the big business in Congress argued that the environmental laws were hindering environmental growth. They got hit in the pocketbook, so they whined and they cried and they carried on. So they pushed to weaken or eliminate the environmental laws during the 70s, and they tried to eliminate the EPA. They tried to knock out the Environmental Protection Agency altogether. They weren't able to knock it out, but they did knock the teeth out of it. It can't really do what it used to be able to do. And also in the 90s, we started to have this, they called them disinformation campaigns, where we knew that the environmental laws, we knew the environmental problems were happening, and we knew what they were causing. The 90s saw the beginning of fake news. A lot of the big businesses were using pseudoscience. It wasn't even real science. It was fake science, propaganda. They fabricated, they made all sorts of crap up to try to convince the general public that the environmental problems weren't really happening, and they still did that. I taught science with a woman, and I had to convince her. She taught science as well. When I first got started teaching, I had to convince her that climate change was really happening, and she taught science. And because of these disinformation campaigns that started around the 90s, they are meant to confuse the public, all right, mislead the public on the important environmental issues. All right, so that was the very beginning of fake news. And these fake news campaigns are still going on. You know that they are. There's been a whole bunch of things that they are saying are untrue about the environmental problems. A lot of things they're saying are untrue, or they're twisting them, and or saying that the damaging stuff that they do is not really damaging when it is, like making a pipeline through some of the most recently they sent oil pipelines through the tundra. And the tundra is one of the most delicate ecosystems there is. They promised that this oil pipeline would be foolproof, that it wouldn't damage the tundra at all. That thing hadn't been up for more than a month before it started leaking oil all over the tundra. And the tundra is incredibly delicate. So they're lying. So since the 1990s, some of the environmental leaders have had to spend a lot of their time fighting to discredit, fighting the efforts to discredit them. They had to keep standing up for themselves. Much of the environment, it's written backwards. Hang on, let's take another second. The sentence is written kind of wonky. The environmental leaders and their supporters have spent much of their time and resources fighting the efforts to discredit the environmental movement. The fake news people are trying to discredit the environmental movement, and so most of the leaders, instead of actually taking care of the environment, they're having to fight these idiots. And so some of the analysis are calling for the U.S. to once again strengthen their role in leading environmental changes and shifting towards an environmental society. The U.S. used to be top of the line in this. And people are calling for them to come back to be top of the line. Now here is our overview of the 80s and after. The 80s started a backlash against environmental laws and regulations because it hit big business in the pockets. The corporations and lawmakers were seeking to weaken the environmental laws using disinformation campaigns. And now there's some calls for the U.S. to once again take the lead in environmental issues. But then again, we have to have a leader who cares. All right, so we're trying to get ourselves into an environmentally sustainable society. So what we want to know is, how do we do this? How do we become environmentally sustainable? All right, so an environmentally sustainable society is going to protect the natural capital and then live off the income. Most of the environmental scientists say that the ultimate goal of humankind is to achieve environmental sustainability. And this means this kind of society would be one that meets the current and future basic needs of all people. We meet the needs of the people now, and we know we can still continue to meet them later. The people's needs should be done in a just and equitable manner, not just the rich people. Just and equitable, not just the rich, without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their basic needs. We don't want to damage the world. We want our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren to be able to inherit a wonderful world. And so this is keeping with all the social factors of sustainability that we learned, I think, in the previous chapter, or one of the previous sections at least. So here's an example. Okay, now when I was talking about living off the natural capital and all that stuff, some of that might not have made sense. Okay, we need to protect the natural capital and live off the income. So this is a money example. And a lot of us will understand money a lot better than we do environment. So let's use this money example. Let's say you win $1 million in a lottery and you put it in the bank, $1 million lottery, and your bank is going to give you 10% interest every year. That means then that every year they're giving you $100,000 just in interest. So if you live off that $100,000, the million stays still. God, that sounds so beautiful. Man, I wish I had some money. All right, so if you have $1 million in the bank and the bank is giving you 10% interest, then they're giving you automatically $100,000 in interest. And $100,000 should be plenty for almost anybody to live on. So if you live on this $100,000, nobody touches the million and it stays there strong. And you're still living, you're living good off $100,000. All right. But if you live past your 100,000 and you start eating into this, all right, then they say if you constantly spend more, if you spend an extra $10,000, that's $20,000 a year. No, even just another 10, so that's $11,000 instead of. Wait a minute, my math, guys, my math is so bad. So the interest is going to give you 100,000. If you even spend just 10,000 more than that, okay, that's what it's saying. The interest is giving you 100,000 per year, but if you start taking even just 10,000 more out of the million, it's only going to last you 18 years. So if you can live off the interest, the $1 million will stay there indefinitely. All right, it's not going anywhere. You'll have $100,000 forever, okay, as long as you only live off the interest. If you start eating into the million, all right, even just little bits, it's gone in 18 years. So the idea then is that we need to protect our capital and live on the income, the interest it provides. If you deplete or waste the capital, then you're going to move from sustainable to unsustainable very quickly. And so we bring this back into, bring it into the environment. All right, so the Earth's natural capital is like a global trust fund. All right, so the natural capital is all of the things that the Earth does for us. It does amazing things for us, free resources all the time, ecosystem services that are available now and in the future to all the Earth and all of her species. They're doing ecosystem services for us all the time. There's tons of things that the Earth does for us. Living sustainably means living on what the Earth does for us. It doesn't mean eating away at the resources. So you preserve and replenish the natural capital, this will supply the natural capital that supplies your income. You preserve and replenish it. And if people find ways to reduce their ecological footprint and expand the benefit of the natural impact. So you want to replenish the natural capital. And when you're living off the income, the interest, okay? So let's see if we can get the overview to make a little bit more sense. So the natural income is the portion of the renewable resources that can be used sustainably. So by living only on natural income, which is sort of like the interest in the example, living only on the Earth's natural income and not depleting the natural capital, that means leave the $1 million alone, then society will move from an unsustainable lifestyle to a sustainable one. Okay, so we need to use the interest, the natural income, and don't deplete the natural capital, the $1 million lottery. Leave it there so it'll stay there eventually. Stay there, not eventually. What's the word? Forever. Unendingly. Forever. I'm trying to think of a different word for forever, but forever works just fine. Okay, now what we do know, we said we needed in the past slide, we need to um, preserve and replenish the Earth's natural capital. The Earth can heal. Ecosystems can recover. In some cases, it might take hundreds of thousands of years, but some of them are much faster. Ecosystems can recover from much of the environmental degradation of human activities. Making a shift toward the more sustainable future involves some tough challenges. The ecosystems are complex and widespread that it might seem hopeless, but it's not. Okay, it might seem hopeless because sometimes it does take hundreds of thousands of years, but it's not true. There's plenty of reasons to hope and plenty of reasons to act. On our next slide, we have two pieces of good news for the social sciences. First, research suggests that it only takes 5 to 10% of the population of a community or a country or the world. It only takes 5 to 10% to make a big, major social environmental change. A few people can make a big change. And second, when we do start the changes, we are actually seeing the ecosystems recover much faster than we ever thought they could. The Earth is really good at healing herself if we will let her. So there's good news. Okay, yes, we have to be more careful. Yes, there are some tough challenges, but it's easy to live sustainably. And once you do so, the ecosystems can recover very, very quickly. So the more sustainable future is possible. All right, here's our overview slide for this one. Given enough time, most of the degraded environments can recover, but many of them will take hundreds and thousands of years. Time is our most scarce resource. Humans don't live that long. All right, so we have to make the best use and the best changes in the amount of time we have, but it only takes 5 to 10% of the population to be able to make a difference, and the changes can occur in a much shorter time than we actually thought. So the anthropologist Margaret Mead, and we've been learning a lot about different people. This is Margaret Mead. She was an anthropologist. She studied lots of different cultures, and she studied early humans, but she also studied many of the more primitive cultures. She summarized the potential for social change. Her favorite quote: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Any changes in the world that have ever been made have been made by small groups of thoughtful, committed citizens." So engaged citizens in communities and schools around the world are right now working to prove her right. And what we say in this chapter, in this test, in this book, in this course, is we should join them. That is the end of this lesson and the end of this chapter. So we'll get together, we'll figure out what's happening next soon. Y'all have a good day.